Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is the re-emergence of several otherwise eradicated diseases, including measles and polio, the unanticipated side effects of gene therapy for one individual, discovery of a variety of somewhat disconcerting microorganisms and insects. Finally, we have for you the investigation of how useful urine is in agriculture. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with re-emerging diseases. First, there is measles. It is the first case of measles to be identified since 2019. That's because measles has been eradicated through vaccination efforts. It was safe, it was obviously effective, and it provided nearly lifelong immunity. The fact that a 17-month-old girl who was not vaccinated and isolating at home acquired it is a concern. The measles outbreak is very similar to others that have occurred in New York. It involved the young child traveling internationally and then returning to Ohio in America. It appears that she acquired measles while overseas. The challenge with measles is, more than anything, that it is highly contagious when coughing and sneezing. It's thought that up to 90% of those who come into contact with someone who has it and are not immunized will be infected. It can live for up to 2 hours in the open environment, which means you can easily contaminate places if you are infected. This means those who touch those infected surfaces and then their eyes, nose, mouths, or otherwise allow it to gain entry into their body will become infected. This leads to the usual measles symptoms: rash, fever, cough, and other similar effects. Measles is not the only disease to be re-emerging, so to speak. Polio has been detected in London's sewer system. Polio is one of those diseases that we had effectively eradicated a very long time ago now. In fact, the last time it was a significant concern was in the very early 90s. The reason for this is that since the 50s, there was a huge effort to develop a vaccine, disseminate it, and eradicate polio. Polio having been one of the diseases that could cause lifelong harm. It was especially harmful when it came to children, which it affected most seriously. It could cripple their legs, destroy their lungs, and even kill. What is odd and interesting about this is that the particular kind of poliovirus found is that which is derived from the vaccine. That means somehow or other, the poliovirus that's used in the vaccine to try and stop it is somehow being found in environmental samples. The upside to this, at least, is that there have been no cases attached to it. It is purely environmental. But should it come close to infecting individuals, that's when we need to worry. The reason this particular version of polio exists is that it allows for the development of immunity without as many of the serious effects. This compares favorably to the wild type. The wild type is only found in a few countries and sits either in reservoirs or those areas that have not been properly vaccinated. The wild type is the one that causes the most serious issues such as paralysis, lung issues, and possibly death. The underlying theory at the moment as to why we're seeing this variant, not the wild type, and only in environmental samples is that there may be a number of individuals, and most likely very localized group of individuals, who have the poliovirus within them, are not up to date with vaccinations or immunizations, and are spreading it. Furthermore, since the UK stopped using the oral polio vaccine in 2004, chances are that this particular outbreak is linked to someone bringing it in from abroad, where they were likely vaccinated. That's because this particular version is attached to that. That means, much like with the measles case we mentioned first, this could be a case of internationalization and globalization leading to the movement of diseases, something that after COVID-19 we are very familiar with. Something that is often seen, by contrast to vaccinations, as desirable and supportive is multivitamins. and the Science-Based Medicine blog has an interesting article looking at how true this is based on a review. This is coming from the US Preventative Service Task Force. They are fundamentally an organization within the US government that exists to look at the benefits and effects of various different things. This particular report looked at multivitamins, things like vitamin E, beta-carotene, vitamin A, iron supplements, etc. All of these are seen as a rather innocuous and harmless thing at worst, and at best beneficial. The reality is, as we mentioned in so many other contexts, vitamin supplements aren't going to serve you any benefit unless you are already deficient for those in your diet. To paraphrase from the Big Bang Theory, it just makes for expensive urine. The recommendations they came out with fall into three categories: that beta-carotene and vitamin E don't do much for cardiovascular disease or cancer, that there's insufficient evidence to assess the benefits of vitamin supplementation for prevention of these, and that there's insufficient evidence to balance the benefits versus the harm of any one or multiple nutrient supplements. Again, though, they focus specifically on cardiovascular disease and cancer. There are some very obvious caveats to this. For example, if you are anemic, iron supplementation is going to be beneficial, but generally anemia is only identified through a physician, and when they do identify that, they then tell you to take this. It's not something you're doing in the hopes that it will make you feel better. That is because the iron supplementation is treating something you are already deficient in, not adding to an already adequate dietary intake. And that's the distinction for many of these vitamin supplements. They are not adding to an inadequate dietary intake. Rather, they are trying to compensate and then overachieve on adequate dietary intake, something that has no notable benefits in any large-scale studies. The article goes further down this line of reasoning and says that it may give a false sense of security and distract people from known and effective measures of treatment. Effective measures of treatment are a big issue in many ways. Most people have access to treatments for what they have. There are, however, rare and exotic diseases that don't have such options available. In other cases, what treatments we do have may not resolve the disorder. For example, if you have cancer, many cancers can be treated surgically, with radiation, or some form of chemotherapy. Others again, for example, transplanted organs can be made possible through immunosuppressants, asthma through the use of corticosteroids, and then there are diseases that have no treatment at present, and some that only just have emerging treatments. One example of this is a throwback to 2019, and it's an article coming from The Atlantic. It's about a person who received an experimental treatment for cystinosis, a genetic disease. It involved taking stem cells from their body, genetically modifying them, and while that was happening, ablating all of their stem cells within their bone marrow. This meant that their body would now be able to receive the modified stem cells that would no longer have the cystinosis gene that was causing the disease. Insofar as effectiveness goes, it worked. There was, however, one small caveat to this. His hair grew back, but in a different colour. His hair was originally a light blonde colour. When it grew back after the modification of his genome, it came back at a very dark blonde. The article goes into detail on how there's a relationship between melanin, one of the things that provide the darker brown pigmentation in hair and skin, and the cystinosis pathology. That by correcting one, it may have, by virtue of interactions of various genes, increased the other, and this would therefore have led to the darker hair coloration. Light hair and light skin being, you could almost say, a symptom of cystinosis. Going from discoveries of treatments that have been around for a little while now to discoveries of things that are very new but also very old. The largest bacterium we've identified to date. It is about the size of an eyelash. Understand, we're referring to a bacteria here, something you often require, if not nearly always require, a microscope to be able to visualize. This giant bacterium is estimated to be 5,000 times larger than most bacteria and 50 times larger than the other known giant bacteria. At 10 millimeters or 1 centimeter, which for imperial viewers is approximately 2/5 of an inch, the giant Thiomargarita magnifica is a huge bacterium. It was discovered in Guadalupe in 2009 and it's taken some time to work its way through peer review, identification, and everything else that's involved with something so unexpected. At such a large size, this bacterium starts to blur the line between prokaryote and eukaryote. Prokaryotes, like just about every other bacteria out there, shouldn't have any membrane-bound organelles. That is, they were traditionally viewed as simply being a large, semi-porous bag full of things like DNA, organelles, enzymes, and anything else required to be able to function. This bacteria has its DNA, enzymes, and a few other things separated into different sections. This creates what is effectively membrane-bound organelles. Another distinction that this bacterium has versus others is that most normally, eukaryotes will split themselves in half. This is how they create daughter cells. Each of them is an exact copy of the genome, along with a split of the various required organelles and other material for the daughter cells to survive and continue to proliferate. This bacterium breaks off a small portion of itself with the required genome and a few other things, and that's how it creates its new daughter cells. In other weird life-related news, we have the beetle larvae that can eat polystyrene. Polystyrene is a very common material used for storage and transport. It is lightweight, it is thermally stable, and it generally will be very easy to make and transport. This makes it desirable for packaging material, food transport, and more. One of the downsides to polystyrene is that it's often very easy to recycle, but more expensive to recycle than it is to make anew. This means that most of it winds up in landfill. If there was a way to be able to recycle it effectively, it would probably become more common to do that. But that's not happened. With this discovery, it might be possible for the organic life forms in question to be able to break down polystyrene and allow for it to be used once and then disposed of. The larvae come from the Xephobus morio beetle, and they are called superworms because they are able to break down the plastic and polystyrene using microbes and enzymes within their GI tract. What's more, they can survive only on polystyrene. The researchers established that of the 135 larvae split into 3 groups, they were able to survive on wheat bran, polystyrene, and to an extent nothing at all. Those that were fed only the polystyrene did grow, and 2/3 of them progressed to becoming adult beetles. This versus the 90% of those who were fed on the bran. This has opened various options on how to try and avoid issues to do with landfill and the mass of plastic waste that winds up in it and will take an incredibly long time to break down. In other environmental news is the possibility of effectively mining the oceans for materials that are becoming more scarce. We say mining the ocean because the things they'll be looking to try and isolate from the ocean are things like rare earth metals, lithium, cobalt, and so on. To a certain extent, you could get things like iron, magnesium, and more. These are all currently things that we are pulling out of the earth itself, and it's quite hard to access much of it. When you look at the proliferation of green energy sources like solar panels, the use of storage technologies such as batteries, electric vehicles, and just the general increase in prevalence of technology, the need for these materials is going up. The accessibility is remaining stagnant if not decreasing. That means the price is going to increase over time. Mining for it in a land-based mine will be much more difficult as you need to go deeper and further afield to find the minerals and metals required for everything that we use today. This is where the two examples that the article describes become very important. There is the seafloor itself with sedimentation or mining much like oil platform drilling, or through filtration of seawater. The latter is at least somewhat easier to describe, in that the seawater will be run through a series of technologies that will either hold onto or absorb various amounts of the specific elements that are wanted. These can then be removed and replaced, and you can continue to build up what is almost like mineral salts on a particular filter, and these can then be removed, processed, and put back into use again. Mining it from the sea is somewhat more difficult, and it would require mobile platforms capable of being able to not only harvest, but to a certain extent process the necessary rare earth materials. The example given in the article are polymetallic nodules. These are large, mineral-rich deposits that have been combined with various bits left over from animals in the ocean, such as shark teeth and bones. These need to be harvested, processed to separate out the unneeded material and the rare metals, and have enough that it can then be brought back to land for further processing. The challenge with both of these is the scale of industrial effect, that is, how much can you process to make it worth the cost? Or if it's not worth the cost now, will it be in the future, and will that then have a huge impact on the cost of all the subsequent technologies that rely on these rare earth minerals? Our final news item for you this week is going back to land, but looking at agriculture and how human waste can be used as a fertilizer. It's a study looking at human urine as a fertilizer for crops. Historically, various forms of waste product have always been used as fertilizer. Guano from bats was one of the most desirable products for a very long time, since it had so much benefit for agriculture. There were practically wars over different locations that were rich in the material. Nowadays, we rely primarily on synthetically created fertilizers. The reason for this is simple. They can be made en masse, and they can be made to a consistent level. The only exception to this in the modern world is organic farming, which has its own problems. This is where the article comes into play. It's describing research led by the National Institute of Agricultural Research of Niger. It looked at the use of urine for fields that are currently in various states of decay. This is due to the depletion of soil nutrients and harsh weather conditions. The study split the participants into two groups, one that continued to use traditional farming methods while the second used human urine, along with animal manure. Across the 3 years of the study, 2014 to 2016, there were 681 trials. Those who used urine and manure had a 30% increase in their grain crop called pearl millet. Given the issues with food security in Africa particularly at the moment, you would understand why this is so important. Increasing a staple crop by 30% may not seem like a lot, but it can make a huge difference in how stable the food supply can be for those who are lowest on the social hierarchy. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.